All right, hey people. My name is Chris Lucas. Today is February 8th, 2025. Um, this is my show, The Protestant View. Um, anyway, this is not going to be a very long show today because I just want to go over something real quick. And first of all, I want to say that I think closed theism is just inconsistent Calvinism, and I don't think it's biblical either. Um, and I know some people will hear the words closed theism and open theism and have a very basic understanding of it. Like they will think, oh, if you're an open theist, you think God cannot know the future. So the future is completely unpredictable for God, and God just has no clue what's going to happen. And a closed theist believes that God can know the future and God can make predictions, but that's not what it is. And I had people, when I originally asked about it years ago, when someone brought up those words, it was presented to me like that, like, oh, those open theists are they're dumb, they don't think God can know the future. I'm like, oh, okay, so that's what it is. I'm just thinking someone's just giving me an honest definition of words, right? And so whenever I heard someone claim to be an open theist, I always thought that was the definition. And I actually had heard an open theist kind of argue that way, where it's like, oh, God just doesn't know. And it's like, well, okay, if that's what it is, then I don't believe that, right? And then it wasn't until I started listening to Warren McGrew, and I saw that, okay, here's this real intelligent guy arguing against Calvinism. Oh, he believes in open theism too. Well, he seems like a smart guy. Why would he believe in this? So I listened a little bit closer. And then as I'm listening, I'm like, okay, so um what exactly is he is he saying? And then I would hear someone like Chris Fisher, and Chris Fisher really helped me out the most, because Chris Fisher basically said, he came on my show one time, and this is after I already accepted open theism, because I was basically just thinking about the words open and closed, right? Because if something's closed, that means you have to have it in a box somehow. That's why I got this illustration up on the screen here, this box. And they basically, a closed theist would say all time and space is in this box. But if it's infinite, how did you put something infinite in a box, right? And I'm like, that does not make sense to me. So I'm like, there's something wrong with closed theism, because how can you close a box if it's got something infinite in it? You got to find the end of it first, and then you build a box around it. But if it has no end, how did you build a box around something that doesn't have an end? Picture that you open a book, right? And because some people would be like, oh, God's outside of time and space. Okay, but isn't that supposed to be infinite and go on forever? Or you're saying life has an ending to it? Because if it's infinite, even though you're outside of the book, so if I'm standing outside of a book, and that book represents time, but that book is infinite, it's like, how do I still know the end of it? I mean, it's infinite. So at some point, it's got to have an ending to it, so I can actually know the book. I mean, if it has a never end, how do I travel to the end of something that doesn't have an end? How do I turn the pages of to the end of something that doesn't have an end? So how can I know the end if I can't turn the page, if it's never ending, right? I mean, there's just like simple logical concepts here, right? And so and Chris Fisher, he helped me understand how Calvinists and closed theists are seeing time. And so what they'll basically say is that, let me bring up this paper I wrote, and I'll go back to this image. Oh, you know what? I got something else I need to read. So I'll bring that image back up. Sorry. Okay, so like the way Chris Fisher explained this to me, and when I bring up Warren McGrew and Chris Fisher, don't think I agree with every nuance of how they view open theism. I'm just saying, like, these guys help me understand that you might want to that I might want to start calling myself an open theist if I think of God a certain way and I think of the future and time a certain way. Because if I think of it the way I'm thinking of it, then that's inconsistent to call myself a closed theist, right? But Chris kind of explained it to me like this. He said, um, closed theists will see God as a frozen being in time, frozen by knowing the future. Thus, God knows the future. The future cannot change because that would mean God did not actually know the future, because if the future changes, then that really wasn't the future and God did not really know it. You kind of understand that. So if, I'm going to run that by people one more time because a lot of people probably haven't thought about that. So a closed theist will say that God is frozen by knowing the future and can't do anything to change the future, right? And so he's helpless against the future, against changing the future, because by simply knowing the future, he can't change the future, because if he knows the future and it was able to be changed, then that would mean he didn't actually know the future, because that wound up not being the future. So that's how a Calvinist is seeing that. And that's how a closed theist is seeing it. So if you're saying closed theism, you are actually saying that, whether you realize it or not. That's what you are saying. So basically, that's why I have this picture of Han Solo frozen, right? Because let's say this is God. This is how a closed theist will see God. This is how Calvinists see God. They see God as frozen. Why is he frozen? Because he's trapped in his knowledge about the future. He can't do nothing. He already knows it, and the future can't change, because if it could change, then that wasn't really the future, and then God didn't really know the future. So I wanted to kind of explain that before I go on to anything else. Um, so let's see here. I saw I already went over that. And so at first I subscribed to a very simplistic understanding of open and closed theism. I heard that open theism was a view that God doesn't know the future, while closed theism was that he does know the future. So much so that even some suggested open theists believe God can be wrong, right? Um, and I had heard that from some open theists, but that's not every open theist, right? Um, so I'm not sure exactly what Chris Fisher believes, and what Warren McGrew believes, but I believe they got slightly nuanced differences, right? And the open theism that I'm arguing for is that God has always been present, and because God is truth, truth has to be present, and if truth is present, um, and God is truth, and God is what establishes truth, God has to be present, right? So it's kind of like this. You could not say there's a moment where God was not present, because if God was not present, God did not exist, right? And I think we would all agree that God has always existed. So if God has always existed, God has always been present. There is no way that God can exist outside of the present. Because if God existed outside of the present, there was a point when he didn't presently exist. He didn't truly exist, because truth has to be present in order to truly exist. But yet, if truth wasn't present, then God wasn't present either, because God was truly not present. So God truly did not exist, right? So you cannot argue that, like, God exists outside of time, therefore he exists outside of the present. There's that concept. If he exists outside of the present, so does Valdor the Magnificent. He exists outside of the present. So does a car that goes at the almost the speed of light. That exists outside of the present. That exists outside of time. But those things don't exist, right? So if those things don't exist, they exist outside of the present, right? Because they never existed before. So and they never existed. So you can't just say, God exists outside of time and mean time as and include the present also. The present and time are two separate things. For instance, let me give you this illustration. Um, I would say that God has always been present. Then, about 6,000 years ago, the sun, moon, earth, stars, and everything came into the present because God created them. Now we have markers, right, and reference points in order to figure out what time is. Because without these reference points, you don't know how much time has passed. Because let's say that God, all you did was you started out in an empty black void, but all you had was your mind and your thoughts. Now, if you have a thought, you would not know how long it took you to have that thought. You have no reference points around. You have no idea how long you've been in that state because you have zero reference points. Um, According to the current way we calculate time and everything, you could have been in that state for a billion years or a nanosecond, or not even a nanosecond, even less than that, right? You have no idea. The one thing you do know is that you've always existed in that you exist and you're in the present, right? Presently, this is your state, and this is the state of everything around you. You would know what the present is. You just wouldn't have any concept of time because there's nothing to give you a reference point of time. So God has always existed and has always been present. I would say that the present is an attribute of God, just like truth is an attribute of God. And truth has to be present for God to truly be present. So all these things combine into one thing. Therefore, you can't separate the two. So 6,000 years ago, the earth, sun, moon, and stars came into the present. And then, like, let's say God was to wipe everything out right now, like he wipes everything out of existence, then we would say, oh, the earth existed for 6,000 years and now it doesn't exist anymore. But God would still be present, right? God would still be present. So even though he wiped out everything that you can use to tell time out of existence, God's still present. And the present state of everything is that the world doesn't exist anymore. Nothing in it exists anymore. Only God. And that would be your current present at that moment. But at that point, you also wouldn't know how long the entire universe has been wiped out, because now you have no reference points. But all you know is that at that present moment, there's nothing existing, right? So let me make sure I'm not missing anything. And so I'll have Calvinists argue with me about how they'll try to say God is not temporal, and time's temporal, and presentness is temporal, and God exists outside of that. But even in that spiritual realm, God would still have to be present in that spiritual realm. That spiritual realm would have to truly exist. It still has to have a present state. Everything still has to have a present state in order for anything to exist. I don't see how anything can exist with outside of a present state, and that present state still has to be true. Truth has to be present, because if truth is not present, then how is anything existing out? Because now you're talking about existing outside of reality. Now you're talking about God's not even real. so so this is why when these Calvinists argue about, like, because people wonder, okay, when I listen to people argue with Calvinists, the Calvinist has this thinking of how time works. And because they view time in that way I described, and they were like, God knows the future, therefore the future cannot change. Therefore, God's trapped and frozen, and by his knowledge of the future. And the future could never change. And that's where all of your Calvinistic thought comes from. So the closed theist is doing nothing but being an inconsistent Calvinist, because they're saying everything's closed, everything's known. And the Calvinist is like, yeah, everything is determined. You can't do anything. So no matter what kind of arguments a closed theist throws at a Calvinist, you're just doing nothing but affirming their Calvinism, because ultimately you're not attacking the core problem, which is their view of time. And this is why I think most Calvinist debates against Calvinism don't really lead to much, because I believe that everyone's failure has been not to first address open theism, closed theism, and time. And if you view time in the way a Calvinist views time and the way a closed theist views time, God is basically dead, because God is frozen. He's stuck. He can't move. There's nothing you can do. It's like, so there's nothing God can do. He's frozen and stuck in his knowledge of everything. It's kind of like they got this like a block universe of time where everything already exists, right? So and really, when I'm thinking about closed theism and Calvinism, there is no such thing as time. It's sort of like a VHS tape, right? Like that VHS tape already has a beginning and an end. That's why it's closed within a tape, right? It's just that they view the tape as being a lot longer. But in order to have a beginning and an ending, you have to have an ending also. It can't be infinite. So to me, it sounds like at some point, if you believe in closed theism, you also have to argue at some point everything becomes frozen and stuck and fixed, or that it's already stuck and fixed. And I would actually probably argue that it's got to go into a loop, maybe, to actually be consistent. But if you think there's going to be an ever-changing, ever-growing life and an active relationship with God, then you can't have closed theism. So let me see if I got any other points. Sorry, I didn't really plan this out too well. I just kind of hit the start button because I was starting to panic because I gave a 4:35 start time and it was getting close to starting. I would like to organize this better, but I had a lot of things that started coming up right before I started the show, which threw me off. Okay, so let's see here. I now subscribe to a view I call strict presentism, which holds that only the present is real. In this perspective, God possesses perfect knowledge of the present, and through that knowledge can accurately predict the likely outcomes. But crucially, that doesn't mean that the future is already fixed. Instead, the future remains open to change. Human choices and divine interaction matter. They can shift the course of events, even though God's understanding of the present remains perfect. So in Exodus 3:14, God makes this declaration, I am who I am, points to his eternal continuous presence. Existence implies being present. Without presence, nothing exists. So God says, I am who I am, or I basically says, I am. That is who he is. Well, if I am, I must be present, right? Truthfully, I must be there, and truth must be present in order for me to be present, and God is truth. See, I mean, I think this is pretty simple to follow, and it gives you a real fair understanding of time and how everything functions. Biblically, this ideal is beautifully captured in Exodus 3:14 when God declares, I am who I am. Notice that God doesn't say, I was or I will be. He simply is always present, right? Because in order for, so yeah, I don't know how much more I really need to elaborate on that. It's just God doesn't say I was, and he doesn't say I will be. He says I am. So he's always present. So God's basically confirming presentism. Without a present moment, nothing would be real. And if God is the foundation of all that is true, then his existence too must be continuously present. And I kind of already went over my wipeout analogy, which was that, God, has always been present. 6,000 years ago, he created everything. And then if he was to wipe it out today, we would still know the earth existed for 6,000 years, but we would just know that the current state of things the earth no longer exists, nothing exists, but God would still be present, right? And that would be the present state of things, is that the earth existed for 6,000. God was present. God created the earth. He let the earth exist for 6,000 years. He wipes it all out of existence. He's still present, and that's just the present state of things. But the present state of things is that earth existed for 6,000 years, no longer exists, right? But God is still present. So I'll just kind of go quickly over this. Bullet points. Imagine you're in an empty, infinite black void. In this void, there are no objects, no landmarks, no clocks. Without these reference points, you cannot measure how long a thought takes. You can't tell if it lasts a billion years or a nanosecond. Application. 6,000 years ago, creation introduced reference points, Earth, sun, moon, stars, that allowed us to measure time. And if you read Genesis 1:14 through 1:16, you'll see that God gives us the sun, moon, for days, years, months, and seasons, right? So that's what we base our time off of, is these original lights in the sky that God gave us. That's what we set our watches to. You know, you can't, like, no one ever sets their watch to time, right? Because if you did, let's wipe everything out of existence, and let's watch you set your watch to time. You can't set your watch to time without these reference markers of change, right? Because basically, any change that happens, you could use as a reference point for time. Because we're now referencing something was like this and one thing changed. So, like, let's say the only thing that changed within a fraction of a nanosecond was that an electron moved partially around an atom. Just one atom in the whole entire universe, an electron moved just a fraction around it. That would be enough to be change in the universe. So the universe was in one present state. Now it's in another present state. Every time anything moves or changes, the present state of things change with it. And we base this rate of change and that we see and observe, and that's what we come up with the concept of time, right? To describe how something was in the past, how something is now in the present. The present is, however, is the present state of everything. The future is what you would think is going to be the present state of everything, but it hasn't happened yet. So I kind of went over that. So I'll read over this. Contrasting views, frozen blocks versus living now. Bullet points. Calvinist closed theist view. Time is an independent fixed continuum, a block universe. God's foreknowledge is static. Every moment is predetermined, results in a frozen reality where human freedom is an illusion. The presentist view is that only the present is real. Time is defined by change. God is continuously present, and the future remains open. Human choices and divine interaction dynamically shape reality. So you actually have life. Like, you're not Han Solo frozen by God knowing the future, and so now we're all just as frozen and as helpless as God, right? What we're arguing is that there is a thing called life, and we're actually living, and we can actually affect the present, and we can affect the future, right? By our actions we do in the present, our relationship with God can actually affect the future. That's what we're arguing for. Like, oh, you got a sick kid, let's all pray together and maybe God can perform a miracle. We wouldn't say, oh, it's hopeless, because I actually talked to a Calvinist and he was being very consistent. And he goes, and I go, oh, well, I guess, how I should pray as a Calvinist would be, let your will be done, oh Lord, since it was already determined anyway. And he's like, yeah, that would be a very consistent view of how we say we should pray. And I was kind of shocked, because I was like, okay, so you're basically saying prayer doesn't matter. And they would say something to the effect of, oh, prayer does matter, because we're acknowledging already, that there's a God and everything. But and I can't remember everything he said, but I was like, but essentially it doesn't matter, it's already fixed, right? Like, you're not going to change anything by praying. And he's like, yeah, that's basically correct. And I would say that if you're a close theist, you got to ultimately argue the same thing, because you actually live in a universe with the same issues, because you say God already knows all the future that's ever going to happen. It's fixed, it's stuck. But you basically have the same sort of view where prayer doesn't matter, it's stuck, it's a fatalistic thing, it ain't going to change. And I would be more than willing, if anybody has, wants to argue differently, leave a video link, or let me know you made a video. I'll go to your channel. I never hate people for promoting their channel, or saying, hey, I got a different idea. And even if I don't watch it, other people can watch it. I don't mind you promoting your channels, your thoughts, your beliefs. You're more than free, to do that. I know how hard it is, just to, a lot of people are actually looking for various channels. They find a lot of stuff on YouTube boring. So, it doesn't bother me when someone goes, oh, I got a channel and I talk about this. Okay. I don't sit there and go, oh no, you're promoting your channel, I'm gonna cry. And it's like, go ahead, promote it. It ain't hurting me none. I don't even care if it's at the same time I'm doing my own show. Feel free to. Anyway, so I said, contrast this with the view held by many Calvinists and close theists. They see time as an independent fixed continuum, a block where every moment, past, present, and future, is already determined. In this model, God's foreknowledge is static and every detail is locked in, creating a frozen reality where human freedom is merely an illusion. But for me, that view is unsatisfying. Instead, I believe that only the present is real, and that time is simply a measure of change. In this dynamic living now, God's continuous presence makes human choices and divine interactions genuinely meaningful, allowing the future to remain open. And in the past, I think I have accidentally made the mistake of saying things like, and I might have said this in a past video, and if I did, I'm sorry, I don't really remember, but I might have said something like, I don't believe in time. And I think that's kind of like not a really good way to explain everything. I would say I believe in the present, and then when God created everything, now we got things to base reference points of change on, and now we can come up with different ways of measuring time. And measuring time is basically measuring the changes going on in the present, measuring past changes, because we would say these things are no longer exist like that, and future changes by measuring the changes we see in the present now. Theological implications: truth, choice, and divine relationship. Bullet points: God is truth. God is truth. His continuous I am confirms that truth, and thus reality is present. The fall as a choice. In Eden, humanity chose between embracing divine truth or living a lie, right? Because the serpent, God said, if you eat of this tree of knowledge of good and evil, you shall die. And the serpent gave mankind another choice of what to believe in, which was a lie. That's why he's the father of lies. And so the serpent says, oh no, surely you shall not die the day you eat of it, right? So now, who do you believe? Do you believe God, who's telling the truth, or do you believe Satan, who's telling a lie? And I basically have this thing. This is why, I like embrace Christianity again, because I went through a period of time in my life where I was like in New Age and everything and trying to figure everything out, because I grew up being told all this stuff, about theology. This is why I got like a lot of issues with the churches today, because I felt like they kind of drove me into New Age. And but one of the things I was thinking was, when I was in that state, because I didn't know, like, how do you define God, and then how do you define reality, right? And I was like, essentially, if I can't figure out what defines truth, then everything is just basically a lie. And if I'm living a lie, I'm lying about living, and therefore I'm dead. It's sort of like, let's say, you have a relationship with a spouse. And let's say that relationship, the reason why they love you is because they think you're faithful, they think you're like this wonderful person, but you're hiding the fact that you had an affair, right? And so now when that person gives you their love, it's based off of a lie. So everything you're receiving is based off of a lie. Now, it could be that if you fessed up and told that person everything, maybe they would still love you. And if they still did love you, well, the truth would be that they still love you regardless of that. But right now, the only love you're receiving is like a thief, because you're basically selling them some goods, selling them, this perception that's not really reality, right? And that's the only reason why you might be receiving their affection or not. You don't know. At this point, you're just kind of living a lie, right? That's why it's really important for people to be honest and be humble, because that way, whatever you have in life, you know that in truth you have it, and you go, oh man, I don't like the truth though right now. Well, work in your life to change things about your life so that it does become something true that you can like, or you can be satisfied with in some way. But by living a lie, you really still have nothing, because a lie is nothing, right? So anyway, the fall is a choice. In Eden, humanity chose between embracing divine truth or living a lie. To live in truth means engaging in the present and aligning with God, and how God sees everything, his perception, because his perception is true. So if God says something's bad, then it is bad, right? Because that's how God sees reality, and God is truth. So, and truth is reality. So, human agency. If the future were fixed, our choices would be illusionary. An open future affirms that human decisions shape reality. So, what are the implications of this view? First, if God is truth, as Scripture tells us, then His eternal I am assures us that truth is continuously present. In the Garden of Eden, when humanity was confronted with the choice between God's truth and the serpent's lie, it wasn't just a test of obedience, it was a fundamental choice about the nature of reality. To live in truth is to live fully in the present and to actively participate in the dynamic unfolding of life. If the future were fixed and unchangeable, our choices would be meaningless. But an open future validates the significance of human agency and shows us that our decisions truly matter. Also validates our relationship with God. Um, and I'll say the present is the only true reality. God's eternal I am is the living, dynamic ground of existence. The future remains open, allowing for genuine human freedom and divine interaction. Our understanding of time should be rooted in the presence of change, not in a frozen block. So I'm not going to read all that. Basically, there's also this thing about Hezekiah, and where God, I can't remember the exact Bible passage, where God talks about he'll add 15 years to Hezekiah's life, right? Well, that would imply that at some point, those Hezekiah did not have those 15 years. And this is where you get into a lot of contradictions with closed theism / Calvinism, because I kind of think they're both the same. And I think they're both unbiblical, and I would say unchristian. Not to say that you're going to go to hell for because you mistakenly believe it, but I don't think that belief, closed theism and Calvinism, are Christian beliefs based on the fact that God's not frozen in time. Your prayers actually do matter. And if someone wants to argue with me about it can be a form of closed theism and I'm just wrong, and you explain it to me. But when I'm thinking about it all and the way you guys present it, it comes across to me as being unchristian, unbiblical. So anyway, back to Hezekiah. So, God tells Hezekiah that he's going to add, Hezekiah was supposed to die, and then God says he'll add. Hezekiah does something, I can't remember the whole story, and then God says he'll add 15 years to his life, right? So that would mean that at some point Hezekiah really didn't have 15 more years to live. Because if he did have 15 years to live, then God just lied, because he says he's adding 15 years to his life. But how can he be adding 15 years to Hezekiah's life if it was already determined and it was already going to happen anyway? So that cannot have already been determined. Now, maybe God could say, I know Hezekiah's going to do this, but you still have to play all this out in the present, and you can't have a future that already exists, like in the closed theist, Calvinist, block universe theory of time, where everything already exists. And like I said, you can't put infinity into a box anyway. If someone can draw me an illustration of how that happens, I would love to see it. So anyway, so if God adds 15 years to Hezekiah's life, he has to actually add it, or else he's just lying. And if you say it's an illusion, well, then it's an illusion, still a lie, right? And we're experiencing nothing but an illusion, so we're not even living life, because everything's an illusion, right? I wish I could find my notes, but I'd have to dig. I should have had that note up there, but I'd like to go into the illusion fallacy. But basically, um, there's, if you have a presentist view that I have, where the future hasn't existed yet, then God actually added 15 years to Hezekiah's life. There was an action that Hezekiah did, and God actually added 15 years to his life. It's not like everything was like a bound, set in stone that it's going to happen, that he's definitely going to add 15 years to Hezekiah's life. Because then, if that was already something that God determined, that God was, bound to do, then Hezekiah already had those 15 years, and God didn't really add them to his life. But see, under this presentist view, it's a lot more consistent with the language we see in Scripture. It's not, this illusion that it's just a movie script, and it's just a play, but it's actually already written. It's like, no, there's actual real interaction as things happen in real time, and real present, right? Probably should say real present, as it happens in the real present. You know, the future starts to change. So Hezekiah does something, and then God adds 15 years onto his life for doing it. So, and I'm just trying to come up with a consistent view, and that's all this is. It's like, how do you read Scripture and have Scripture be consistent and have a concept of time and present that matches to what Scripture says? Okay. So I want to keep this video short so other people can watch it and understand what I mean when I say I reject closed theism, and I see it as unbiblical. So now I'll read the comments, and then I'm going to close the video. So Adrian says, we are in the box, and God is outside the box. When we enter the eternal here, we exist in the box, but the box, we are in the box, and God is outside the box. When we enter eternal hereafter, okay, we exit the box, but the box we were in remains. Okay, what I'm saying is that outside the box is still present, right? That's still a present state of everything, right? And so God, he's presently like, this box here is the present. I mean, but God's not really in that box. Like, I see God as being in a reality with us, right? Truth is reality. And when God created the universe entered into reality. It became real. See, God is always real, right? So, but was the universe always real? I don't think so. But God at some point made the universe real. So now the universe is existing in reality with God. And you can say, like, so I don't get the whole outside the box, to be honest. Because, reality is reality. Either the earth, God didn't really create the earth, or God did create the earth. And even outside that box, you're saying either God's real or he's not real. I would say God's always been real and God's always been truth. So I don't, that's my problem. I don't see a sensical way of where you go, well, God wasn't present or God wasn't truth. Well, if God's not truth, he's never going to truly be there unless something else makes him true, right? So that would require something beyond God to make God true. Therefore, then God can become true, but then that thing that's beyond God would actually be God, right? And God wouldn't really be God. So that's why I don't, it's like truth. We have to acknowledge that truth has to be present. And I just don't understand how this whole outside the box, because I know what people are trying to do. They're trying to say that God is outside of present and present's part of time, and God can exist outside of that. And I and it, but my whole thing is present and time are two different things. And time is just a measure of changes going on within this universe. No matter how minuscule there is, if there's just one little change, there was a change in the present. Thus, um, a way you can record a change in time, right? Like, because time would just be a record of the current state of presentness, you know? That's kind of how I would see time. Just time, a record of current state of presentness. And if there's nothing in there, then there's nothing you can reference time with. So Adrian says God created the world box, knowing everything that would happen in the box, knowing each of our free choices. Then he returns at the end of the box and make a new box that has no sides. Yeah, it's still the same issues. And he said this earlier, so I don't know. Like, he said this before I even gave my presentation. So, and hey, truth unfiltered. Aaron says Isaiah 46:9-10. I am God, there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, from ancient times, things that are not yet done. Okay. He can, a guy can still declare the end from the beginning in my presentist view, right? He can still look at everything happening in the present, now I know some would argue that he does not have perfect knowledge of the present, and maybe that's true. I haven't thought about it, but in my current view, I would say that God is able to have perfect knowledge of the present. There might be a possibility where God just chooses, like, if like, you can know the course of events without having to watch every single event and every single thing happening. Like, I know this guy who's a meth head, and no matter what kind of stories he tells me and emotional things that happen to him, I know that he's going to wind up losing his job in about 2 weeks that he just got and be right back in this one spot, just based on his friends and everyone he's associating with. And I can just see all the wheels working in his head, right? And I don't have to I don't have to know every detail of his life. I know just enough about him to know where he's going to be in 2 weeks, right? And I think God, by having more perfect knowledge, would know, even how many times he's going to brush his teeth that day, and how many breaths he's going to take that week and everything like that. I believe God can know that. But God can also have just like a general knowledge where he doesn't need to know all those details. He knows just enough to where he can still predict the future, and might not have to watch over every single detail. But my current view is that God can know the present perfectly. Therefore, since he knows the present perfectly, he can predict the future perfectly. So he doesn't have to have a pre-existent future in order to know it, right? It doesn't have to all be written down on a videotape or in a book where it can't change. God can know everything now perfectly and have a relationship where he gets to know the souls and their choices and their being. He could have created a people that he has to get to know, that he has to witness their choices to know them. So, but regardless, I think in this presentist view, that he can declare the end from the beginning because, well, first of all, he created everything. So, not, I mean, I can predict things about people pretty easy, right? Like, I can predict, if a guy's gonna fumble in a football game, things like that, how a guy's gonna box, especially boxing. Boxing's fairly simple. When I know like a guy and I know his mental makeup, I can kind of predict things, about how this guy's gonna fight and everything. Um, and just by knowing his mental makeup. So um and so I can kind of declare the end from the beginning, the end of a fight from the beginning of the fight. And that's not, and I did not even create people. So God knows way more about how every individual cell in a person's body is working, their state of being, their state of health, everything. He knows their life, he knows their patterns, he knows even the sin they might be caught up in. And I think sin is like a disease, and you can even see the course that disease is going to follow, right? So if God knows all these things, I think it becomes nothing for him to predict the future. Like, he doesn't have to already see a written out future. I think it's nothing for him to predict the future based on knowing the present perfectly, or at least knowing the present in much more detail than any of us know it. And he can easily predict, 2,000 years, 5,000 years, 6,000 years, 10,000 years into the future. I don't see that as a problem. So this verse doesn't do nothing to affect my view, because I think by knowing the present perfectly, by being the creator and having an intellect, that will far exceed the greatest AI, supercomputer, human intelligence, anything combined, that he can easily make these predictions. And I mean, if you ever talk to people enough, you'll notice a lot of people are like automatons. And I'm really sorry to say that, but man, when I start to debate people, I start to realize, like, what they're almost like automatons. Like, because I'll debate the AI and I'll debate a person. I'm like, wow, there's almost no difference. They're like automatons the way they answer. So especially, if people reduce their beings to basically being a bunch of non-thinking automatons, it becomes really, easy to predict them. Especially, most people have a very sheepish sort of being, where they just kind of follow everybody else, and they're not even sure why. They just follow people out of safety, out of emotion, out of not wanting to be alone. They'll just kind of follow along without thinking about it, without questioning it. And some people don't want to question it because they go, well, if I start to question it, that might create division. I don't want to create division. I'll just go along with what everyone else thinks, right? And God can recognize this stuff. And he knows there's probably very few people that even go and challenge that sort of thinking, and that aren't thinking like automatons. So it's probably gets real easy for him to predict anything. So Truth Unfiltered says, I agree with what you're saying, Chris. When we say things like it didn't happen the way scripture reads, we are actually undermining God. Reminds me of the movie Arrival with Amy Adams, where the squid-like aliens, where when they speak in terms of past, present, future, where each choice changes the outcome of the circle. No, that's definitely not Squid Game. He's the movie Arrival with Amy Adams. But he's saying they're squid-like aliens, though. So I guess what he's saying is that, basically these aliens speak in terms of past, present, and future, where each choice changes the outcome of the circle. So they basically would be presentist, right? So where they believe that there is actually a present. Whereas in closed theism and Calvinism, there is no such thing as present, really. Present is just where the spotlight is. Because if you look up, what's it called? The block universe theory of time. They basically think that there is no real present. It's just wherever the spotlight is on this whole block of time, that would be the present, But there is no real present because it's already written out. So, like, in God's view, it's a written book. So presently, our present really isn't the present. It's finished. It's all past. So they basically believe all there is a past. Calvinist and closed theists, they would say everything's in the past. There is no present. It's all in the past. It's all finished tape because it's closed. Because if it was open, then it could change. It can't change because God knows the future. And if the future could change, that would mean God didn't really know the future. And so, therefore, to acknowledge that the future can change at all would be to acknowledge that God didn't know the future and God has to know the future. Therefore, the future can't change. Therefore, everything's fixed. So everything's closed and everything is actually past. So all you have is the past, and we exist in the past. And all we're doing is it's like a movie that's already finished, and we're just watching it. And the spotlight in the block universe would be the TV screen of the movie we're watching, right? And that's how they view reality. Um, and I don't think that's reality because it's past. We are actually in the illusion of thinking we're living reality, but we're not even living because everything's in the past, right? But we're thinking that's reality. But see, now we're just caught in delusion and lies because God trapped us. I mean, I guess God must be the devil because God trapped us in the past, right? And we're thinking we're in the present, and that we're heading towards the future, but everything's actually all past because everything's done, everything's finished, right? I mean, so to me, it's like, we're all basically dead because it's all in the past. I mean, we just think we're alive. I don't know. It's just weird because I think everything's frozen, and plus, it's just the absurdity of thinking you can box something up. Are you telling me like there at some point there's not going to be any present, right? Like, so is there not going to be existence? So truth's not going to be present. So it's you start to actually think about all this and it just becomes very nonsensical. Whereas the present view, as I explain it, God's in the present, God is truth, truth is always present. And for something to exist, it has to exist in truth, right? And so we know God is truth, God's there, therefore, and God's always existed, therefore, God's always been present. And then simple as 6,000 years ago, all of creation entered into the present because God created everything 6,000 years ago. And so now we have even markers for time because we can tell by, the sun and the moon and all the changes that went on, what exactly was 6,000 years in the past, what was 5,000 years in the past, 4, 3, 2, 1, we got time markers now. And then if God was to erase everything, we would still have a universe that had existed for 6,000 years. But now, if God wiped everything out of existence, God would still be present, but you wouldn't have a marker of time. So, okay, so see, that's the problem with closed theist and slash Calvinist because they say, because Adrian's saying that present is a point in time, and he says, I don't think God is limited to the present. See, I think God doesn't exist in the future. I don't think God's a time traveler, and I don't. It's like God. It's not that we're limiting God to the present. It's that in order to even be present, you have to be truth. So, like present is an attribute of God, no different than truth or existence, right? Existence is an attribute of God. Truth is an attribute of God because these things are part of what God is. Because in the Bible, God says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." Well, Jesus says that, but I believe Jesus is the Son of God and God, but I know some people don't believe that. That's fine. I'm just saying, to me, I see God as saying that He is truth, and therefore, um, was there a time when truth wasn't present? And I don't think you can go, well, we can't limit truth to the present. Okay, then when did I mean? At what moment was truth not present? What moment did truth not exist? See, the present is how the current state of things. Like there's a current state of God, and you can't define the present. You don't know how long the present has actually been, right? You would, without time markers, you have no idea. Like, I don't think God has to think in sequence. um and like when he's all by himself, just in the present, nothing else around him, he's not, I don't think he has to think in sequence or anything. It might not even be his being to even have thoughts in sequence. We can only measure the way God does things in sequence after he creates the universe and creates matter. And now, based on changes in matter, we can say, okay, here's the sequence of God doing things, right? But there was still the present. If the present is existence, and I feel like when you guys say God exists, God's not limited to existence, then what is God limited to? I mean, God just exists, right? So when someone says God's not limited to the present, that's, to me, it's just like saying God's not limited to existence. What does that mean? You know? I know, Adrian, you said first you are anti-Calvin. Second of all, God created time. And I explain how time exists, right? But the present has always existed, because the present's part of God. That's what I'm trying to get you to understand. The present is an attribute of God, because you would never say there's a time when God wasn't present, because you would never say there's a time when God didn't exist, right? There was never a moment. There was never a point. Maybe I shouldn't use the word time. There was never a point. There was never a moment when God did not exist. We would say God has always existed. God has always been present. Time is something that was created once stuff in the universe was created, because now we got a measurement, something to measure change with. We can go, okay, this thing changed in reference to this thing over here, and now we can measure how much change has occurred and the rate of change. But without stuff to measure the rate of change, how do you measure the rate of time? We've never seen someone get a watch and they go, hey, I'm going to set my watch to time. It's like, no, you set your watch according to some other timepiece that's based off the movement of the sun around the earth, or some people would say the earth around the sun, right? And that's what they base their sense of time, their sense of a 24-hour day, right? And then they make this thing called a watch, and they set that watch to that cycle. But they don't go and make a watch and set it set it according to time, right? So you say yesterday isn't present and tomorrow isn't present. Yeah, that's exactly it. I believe that. And you say yesterday is real and it is past. Well, the record of yesterday is real. Yesterday does not, the way I view yesterday, it no longer exists because there was a minuscule change. As soon as you have like even an electron going around an atom, just a fraction of movement of an electron going around an atom, that's a change in the present. So the present that had existed no longer exists, because that electron moved around that atom. So there was a change in the present, and that other present no longer exists, and that's what we would call yesterday, right? And until there's a different change in our present, then you don't have a future. But as soon as you have any changes in your present, now we progress to the future, but now the future is no longer the future. It's now the present. And then as soon as there's another change, that becomes the past. I mean, I think this is pretty simple. I don't even understand a Calvinist, because they'll say, oh, God exists outside of time. And I'm like, or outside the present. And to me, it doesn't make sense to me, because I'm like, okay, God exists outside of existence. You don't think there's a God. You don't think God exists, or you think there's some point when God didn't exist. Like, it just, like, truth has to be present. All right. And it's just like those things are just all interwoven. Truth, present, existence, being. Was there a time when God did not be? Was there a moment, a point where when you would say God was not a being because he wasn't there? It's like he's got to be present, and if you're present, you're being. Being, you're being, right? Yeah, you are being, and so you have to have a present moment to be in. There has to be a present to be in to exist. And I feel like when people say, "Oh no," um, there God exists outside of present. Okay, God exists outside of being. So it's like the concept of time and present are two different things. Um, Young Poet says, and the physical world is the present. Yeah, see that's pretty close, man, because it's like the physical world as it exists right at this exact moment. That would be the physical world would be the present, because it would be the present state of everything. Or Mary should read this. Yesterday and the future are real things that exist but aren't physical. Only the present. Only the present is the physical world. Oh, see, I wouldn't say the future are real things. I'd say the future is a possibility. And yesterday is just how things were. And the present is the current state of everything as it is now, not just the physical world, but just the state of everything, the state of all reality. Okay, so Adrian says, without the past, we wouldn't have houses. Well, without the present, we wouldn't have houses, right? And there were changes that occurred in the present over time that led to us having houses. That's how I would say it, right? If the present ceased to exist, even if time, you wouldn't have you wouldn't have a house. The house wouldn't be there because you got to have the present to have the house. You see, you could actually take and just freeze the whole entire universe and not have any change whatsoever. Just everything's just frozen, nothing moving, and you would still have a house. It would be present, but you would have no change in time. But the house would still be there. The present reality would be the house is there, but not a single molecule has moved in the entire universe, right? So you can have a house in the present without having time. If time just freezes, but now you're talking about human thought probably is frozen, everything's frozen, nothing's changing. So Young Poet says, I think when people say God exists outside of time or transcends time, they mean he transcends space-time continuum, which had a beginning, not necessarily referring to as being the extra dimensional. Yeah, see, I think that is the problem. That's why I kind of made this video, because I wanted people to understand that when presentists speak of time and the present, at least for me, I see it as two different things. And I don't know if other presentists have properly conveyed this point, and that's why I made this video, because I think this point needs to be conveyed before I move on to having a discussion with closed theists or Calvinists, especially because by them thinking that time exists a certain way and the present is part of time, I think that's where we run into problems, because the present is not part of time. Time's a separate thing from the present. Present's just the current state of everything, and then time, I can say, well, 2000 years ago there was no electricity, um and there was no airplanes and things like that, right? But and so time gives me reference points of how things were in the present. So in the present 2000 years ago, there were no um there were no airplanes in the sky. But now 2,000 years later in the present, there are. It gives me a reference point to talk about changes within the present. But if you wipe out everything, you would still have the present, because the present state would be there's nothing in existence. But God would still know he's present. God would still be present, even without a single thing to mark change, right? God would still be present. But you wouldn't have nothing to reference time on. Like, as soon as God wipes out the entire universe and wipes out all of creation, if he was to do that, and there was nothing but a blackness and a void and just God's being, right? At that point, you wouldn't know how long God had wiped it out. It might seem to you like God just wiped out all of existence, but at that point you would have no idea how long it's actually been, because you have no reference markers of how much time's passed by. You could just be thinking real slow, right? And it might take you a billion years to go, wow, everything's wiped out. Everything just got wiped out. You have no idea at that point. You just have the present and knowing what the present state of things are. So you say spaces are beyond us, and I don't think so. Okay, so Young Poet says, I see what you're saying. You're defining the present as that which exists. Yes, exactly. Makes sense. Interesting topic to think about. Yeah, it took me a while to figure out exactly how to articulate this. I'm not going to lie. It took me a long time. That's why I'm really appreciative of Chris Fisher, who's got a channel called God is Open. Now, I don't agree with him eye to eye on the way he views open theism, but the one thing that helped me was when he helped me understand how other people see time, right? Because when he told me that a Calvinist sees God as being frozen in time because of his knowledge of the future, so therefore God can't change anything. Because if God was to change something, if the future was to change, then God really didn't know the future. Since a Calvinist would say God knows the future, then the future must be fixed and unchangeable. But I just wondered, okay, let's think about trillions and trillions of years from now. You're telling me that can't change either. That's set in stone. Even trillions and billions of trillions of years from now, because you got to think everything's going to go on forever, right? So if everything's going to go on forever infinitely, an existence isn't going to stop, basically, right? So if existence is not going to stop, and you're going to think existence is going to go on forever, even saying existing outside of time, existing outside of present doesn't do any good, because isn't that a present state of existence, right? So you're not escaping this by going, well, God exists outside of the present. And it's like, no, because that would still be a present state things are in, right? Am I not presently in heaven, or am I presently in heaven, right? Am I presently with God or not with God, right? There's still a present state. You're not getting out of present that way, because to me it's like, but beyond reality, well, beyond reality doesn't really matter to me. Beyond truth, well, beyond truth doesn't really matter to me, because it's not reality, right? I'm just not going to play with those concepts. It's like, let's keep it simple. Present means truth, and present is how things truly are at this present, right? As simple as that. I think it keeps everything nice and simple. Is this not philosophy? We can't really prove things we don't know, but you can think of things logically. And logically, how is something existing without being present? And doesn't truth have to be present, right? So at some moment, truth has to be present. Truth has to exist. And if truth exists, then that is present in of itself. And God is truth. So I just don't see how someone can say that God's outside of the present, because I'm at that point, the present state. So God's outside of a present state. What state even is that? Is it like non-existence? Okay, how does God exist? You're saying God does exist. Okay, he exists somewhere, right? Even if you must go, okay, exists in a spiritual realm. Okay, so he exists in the spiritual realm. That's still a state of where he's at. It's like that's still a reality, right? Or does that, or are we waiting for God to start to be present? Or has God already been present? You know, has God always existed, or are we waiting for God to exist? See, when I say God has always been present, I'm saying God has always existed because I'm not waiting for him to be. God doesn't refer to himself as I am the I was, or I am the I will be. He goes, I am. He refers to himself as the I am. That means he's always been present to me. But so you say your present is in the USA, mine is in the UK, and God is everywhere. Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with that. I'm presently in the USA, you're presently in the UK, and God is everywhere. All right. But God is still everywhere at this present moment, if you want to say that. Now, I know some people might argue God's not everywhere, but let's just, sake of argument, God everywhere. He's omnipresent, right? He can be everywhere. He's still everywhere in the present. It's not that he will be everywhere. He's everywhere in the present, right? And if you got rid of the USA and the UK, God's still everywhere that he can be, still present. So anyway, Psalm 19:1 says, the question I love to ask classical theists is this: if heaven is ethereal and not and a non-physical realm, where is Jesus's physical body since he is in heaven? That's an interesting question. I got to think about a little bit how to apply that. Because that might be able to be framed into a good argument to help these people understand where we're coming from. Because I'm still trying to figure that out, how exactly to frame that. It's just that when I was talking to this Calvinist, I couldn't get him to explain what the present was. So I was like, well, this makes sense to me about what the present even is. Because to him, the present, whenever he described it, like I said, it was basically like the block universe of time, where, they believe like the spotlight is what we would call the present. It's not really the present because the future already exists, right? So again, it's like the present, if the block universe theory was true and all of the past, present, futures all already existed, if the block universe, the way Calvinists and closed theists see it, that would be just like a movie cassette. And as you're watching the movie and it's at the 1 hour and 15-minute mark, that would be you would call that present because that's the present point on the video cassette. But in actuality, that's a finished movie. Like, we're not waiting until that movie's done. That's a done movie. We're calling it the present. Like, the present moment in the movie. But in actuality, if you step outside of it, like they say God's outside of that, well, then that's a finished movie. They're saying the past, present, and future are all finished. So if that's the case, what we would be witnessing would be in the past. Like, everything's in the past, and we're not really witnessing the future, and we're not witnessing the present. We're just witnessing something that's already done with. Well, if it's already done with, then it's all the past. So there is no future. It's just everything is past because everything's a finished, closed product, right? And what I'm saying is, if you even apply the word closed to your theism, you have to say that you have to basically agree with the Calvinists and say it's a finished book, it's a finished product. Because how can you close something unless it's finished, right? And that goes back to why they got the block universe of time. And that's what they mean by the spotlight. And the spotlight would be like a videotape, whatever frame you're on, that's where that spotlight is, right? And we call that point, and they call that, wherever that spotlight is, that would be the present. But it's not really the present because it's already done, right? It's already happened. So they don't really have, they don't really have a real present. It's just all past, and it's what we're experiencing, what we think we're viewing. But even what we think we're viewing, we might go, well, we're currently viewing it, and that's the person, but that's not even the present, because that's in the past, because all that's been decided. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And I just think that alone is just it's just nonsensical. It makes all words nonsensical. But they'll be like, well, God's outside of it, and they'll go back to that, and I'm like, but that still doesn't solve it, because if God's outside of it, that just proves what I said, is that everything's in the past according to you, and there is no present, there is no future. It's like, time becomes just the past. So Young Poet says, when Jesus ascended, he ate and you could touch him, but he would simultaneously disappear and appear, or the transfiguration where they witnessed a glorified Christ, Moses, and Elijah. So Adrian says, it's interesting, but I'm not sure that you aren't boxing God into a different box called present. So I'm not so comfortable. Well, I'm not boxing them into something called present. It's like saying, oh, I'm not comfortable with you boxing in God into truth. It's like, well, God is truth. God is present. God's always been present. It'd be like saying, I don't like you boxing God into existence. Well, God, it does exist, right? It's like the problem is the way people think about the word present, and they just think of, oh, this is the current frame we're at in this movie I'm watching that's already predetermined, right? So, and they would just say, well, the whole movie's past. And I'm uncomfortable with saying everything is past, and that everything is frozen, and that nothing can change. So I think that's a bigger issue than me painting God into existence, until boxing God into existence is like, well, God's always existed. And it's not really boxing him in. It's just, if you're truth, you're truly there, you're truly present. That's as simple as it is. So Young Poet says, I think heaven is something like the physical world as we experience, but more. I think so too. I haven't thought about it too much because I'm just trying to deal with life, but yeah, maybe that's something I got to think more about. Young Poet says, Adrian Mason, I think it's good to always err on the side of caution. Philosophy is interesting. It's fun to speculate, but stay humble. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Theology is king. Yeah, I agree with that too. I just feel like this is erring more on the side of, in my view, is erring more on the side of caution, right? Especially the language in the Bible seems to indicate that you can have prayer that can change the future. So, therefore the future is not determined. I don't want to have a fatalistic God in which when I pray, I can't change anything because everything's fixed, because God's trapped within his own knowledge of the future. So now God's frozen like Han Solo, right? And going back, because I know I got some new people, earlier I showed this analogy. And I said, basically a closed theist Calvinist would say, this is God. So Han Solo represents God. And now everything around him, everything he's encased in, he's trapped in his knowledge about the future. So this is how closed theists see God. So God cannot move because, I know the future. And since I know the future, it can't change, because if it can change, that means I didn't really know it, so it's stuck. I mean, that's how they kind of try to argue, whereas a presentist would say, well, God knows the present perfectly, or some might argue that, that God knows a lot about the present. He knows, he created people, so he can predict things pretty accurate. But I would say God can predict things, perfectly, because I think God has perfect knowledge of the present. But, I know that's up to debate for some people. But my view of open theism currently as it stands is that God knows the present perfectly. And but everything he can know about it, right? And then he can know people like, oh, I know that you believe in me, and things like that. So he can get to know his creation. And as he gets to know people, that can also change the future. We can also anticipate how they're going to react also, based on how he knows sin works in a person, how he knows some people get stuck being like automatons. And to him, everything is probably very predictable to him because he created everything. He knows how everything's going to function. He can predict where every molecule is going to be, probably pretty accurately, just by creating everything and knowing how everything functions in the world, how a human being functions, when a human being gets too comfortable, what they're most likely to do when they do get too comfortable, and all this stuff, right? So I don't think it's a small thing for him to predict the future by just knowing the present. And I don't think you have to. So a closed theist would say that God's not trapped like that he just knows the future perfectly, and that's why he can make predictions. Because me personally, like, I believe Daniel 9 was a prediction God made about the future, and I believe he made that more than 500 years in advance, right? Because I think he gave that vision to Daniel around 539 BC. And that, basically he predicted events that would start around the year 457 BC and lead up to the crucifixion of Christ, which I believe happened in 31 AD, and with 34 AD being the ending of the 490-year prophecy, right? And I believe God can predict all that. And that does not affect my view of open theism. In fact, that goes perfectly with it. God can perfectly know the present, and he knows people and can perfectly predict the future based on everything he knows about the present. But if I was to sit here and go, hey, God, I pray to you this and or that, God can change the future based on what I pray about. That doesn't mean he will change the future. It just means he can change it according to what I pray about. And you could have a view of God that looks almost like Calvinism and looks almost like closed theism. But I would say that's a very inaccurate view of time and a very inaccurate view of God, to say that it is that view, right? But God can know everything and have everything so arranged for trillions of years if he wants to, and be able to predict everything for the next trillion years perfectly, down to how many breaths you'll be taking, when you're going to brush your teeth. I believe it's possible God can predict all that stuff a trillion years from now. That might be possible. But that trillion years hasn't existed yet. And God's not trapped in making sure those things happen. So just because he knows what might happen, he's not trapped in that knowledge. And that those events a trillion years from now can change. So Young Poet says, King, the realm of philosophy, to be clear, hello, not little King, Christ is king. I'm not really sure. I might miss something. I'm sorry. Oh, I guess he said earlier this. Oh, anyway, I'm not really following. Sorry. And Adrian said, maybe you can work out Revelation 17:8 and help us understand. I might have to do that later. I got to go pretty soon. I'm going to flash that up on the screen and even see what it is, though. I can't even remember Revelation 17:8. I do want to flash that up on the screen, though. But here, I'll read this real quick before I do that. Block universe time is, and this is what Calvinists and closed theists believe in. Block universe time is a theory of time that suggests all of time, past, present, and future, exists in a four-dimensional block of space-time known as the block universe. According to the growing block universe theory of time, it's not really a growing block, though, if you really think about it. They'll try to argue, but that it doesn't make sense because it already exists. So it can't really grow because it already exists. So I guess, or maybe try to say it grows in like an algorithmic feature, but I would argue that means the future didn't exist. and therefore God didn't know it. So you're going to destroy your own view if you say it can grow. So I don't think this is accurate. This is just some random thing I pulled up, right? But they would say the present is an objective property to be compared with a moving spotlight. By the passage of time, more of the world comes into being. Therefore, the block universe is said to be growing. Okay, so that's what they mean by said to be growing. So it would kind of be like, well, the movie's growing as you're watching frame by frame. So you're like, the movie got longer because it was at the 0 minute mark. Now it's at the 1 minute and 1 hour and 15 minute mark. So the movie grew. So I think they mean growing in that way, but it's all fixed. It's all said and done. It's just growing like that. I think that's what they mean. Okay. It's not really growing, right? Because we know the movie is like a finished product. So it's kind of nonsensical. So anyway, Revelation. This is just so I know in the future and other people know what you're meaning. So the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come out of the abyss and go into destruction. The inhabitants of earth, whose names may have not been who and the inhabitants of earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. I see what you're saying. Whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. I have to look up what the Greek meaning of from is. I know I've dealt with this in the past. I just can't remember. Like I gotta kind of think about that wording, because I don't read that as like it was like written before the world was even founded, right? Like that's not how I read that verse. But I can't think of all of it. It's like I'm tired. I got other things that are starting to hit my mind because I got to get out of here. I got to go to work as soon as sun goes down, so I got to start getting ready for work. So sorry. I mean, I think there's a very simple thing if I got to actually sit there and think about it for a minute, but I just don't have time. So I'm just going to kind of read these other comments and then close this out. So you said, wait, are you an open theist? This is my first time being here. To my understanding, open theism is defined as God not knowing the future. Yes, young poet, I am an open theist, but it doesn't mean that God doesn't know the future. The way I define it is that the future can change. So God can predict the future perfectly by having perfect present knowledge. So and plus he also created everything. He knows how every molecule works. He knows how human beings work. He designed the animals. He'll know everybody's habits, what they're bound to do, what kind of babies they're bound to give birth to, what those babies will do, how they will mother and father them, and all this other stuff. All the animals, every single insect, every single thing going on at once. And it's nothing for him to understand all of this happening, right? And how all these things coordinate and function together, right? And my argument is that God doesn't have to have a pre-written movie where he's finished, he's done with it, to know the future. My argument is that God can take present knowledge and predict the future based on everything he knows now, and that if you pray and interact with God, that can possibly change the future. Just like, when he told Nineveh that, he's going to destroy Nineveh, he told Jonah that he's going to destroy Nineveh. Well, he didn't lie when he didn't destroy it, because at that present moment, the way everything was, he was going to destroy it. And then Jonah ran away because he knew, well, if I go warn these people might repent. And I have a good feeling they will repent. So I'm going to run away from God because I know this isn't a predetermined thing. So even Jonah didn't believe that. Oh, destiny set. Jonah goes and tries to run away, and because he's like, I don't want to preach to those people. And then God causes a bunch of events to happen, and Jonah goes and preaches to those people. And then he's like, and he gets mad at God. He's like, God, I knew if I, told those people that they'd go and repent, and you are a merciful God and you spare them. right? But see, under that, if the block universe theory of time was true, which is what Calvinists and closed theists believe in, they would believe that that's already happened. So God would then be lying to Jonah because he'd say, well, I'm going to destroy him, but yet he never did destroy him, right? Um, because he's going, well, I am going to destroy Nineveh. Well, are you? Then you predicted wrong, didn't you? No, because, but see, under presentism, I can make it to where everything makes sense and God's not a liar. God knows the present, and in the present, he knows he will destroy Nineveh. So when he's saying, I will destroy Nineveh, he's not lying. He will destroy them. Because based on the present and the way everything is in the present, he will destroy Nineveh. So Jonah goes, warns Nineveh. Now God doesn't destroy Nineveh, but God did not lie when he said it because God knew the future. Not that now God might have predicted that this would all happen, but to say that God knew the future already, like it was all like you already knew this movie was going to play out this way, you'd be lying at that point. Because you knew that what you weren't going to destroy him, but you said you were. So, but by saying that no, the future has not happened yet, and everything's not a pre-written script. Well, now we have a present where God says, "Hey, I'm going to destroy those people," and that is what God's going to do. And then Jonah warns them. That changes things. Now we have created a change in the present, and now God is reacting to that change in the present. And he says, well, now that the present is differently, I'm not going to destroy those people. So see, God's not lying in this case. All right. Because it wouldn't be because God made a false prediction, right? Because if he would have said that he will destroy those people, he's at that moment he's lying. If that the future was already written in stone, which is what a Calvinist and closed theist believe. The future's already written in stone. It's already happened. It's all past. I mean, we are watching the movie, but the movie's already written. It's already in the past because, from God's point of view, this is a finished tape according to the closed theist and the Calvinist. So because it's a finished tape, it's all in the past because God's outside of it and he's viewing it, right? And this is all in the past. We're watching the movie, but it's actually all in the past because it's all been determined according to their view. So now if God tells Jonah anything in the movie, he's kind of lying because didn't God know at that point whether he was going to destroy Nineveh or not? And now he's kind of like lying to him. He's like, I am going to destroy. Oh, well, you didn't destroy it. But didn't you know the future, God? So if you knew the future at that time, and knew it meaning it was a predetermined thing, not knew it as he's predicting, but knew it as it's a predetermined thing. Well, now God's lying. But if it's not a predetermined, pre-written thing, well, God's not lying. So now if God's like, I am going to destroy Nineveh, doesn't do it, well, based on the present state of things, he was going to do it. And he's not lying if the present changes and he decides not to do it. And so that's the problem that, closed theists and Calvinists run into is, now they got a guy that's not really being totally honest with people. It's just like, to me, open theism is just a lot cleaner, easier to understand theology and view of the Bible, It's just, there's a present, God can know it perfectly, and God can perfectly predict the future by knowing what's going to happen in the present. Being present to are open theists out there. There are presentists out there that might nuance all this differently, and that's why I'm making this video, because I don't like how they quite do that, and just being clear with people that don't think open theism means God doesn't know the future. That's not what open theism means. There might be some open theists that say that, so don't get me wrong, Because that's why I rejected open theism at first. I thought whenever someone said they're an open theist, oh, you're saying God can't know the future. No, I reject that. And then I find out, oh no, open theism just means the future's open to change. The future is open. Oh, so when I pray, I can actually change things. That's what you're saying. Yes. So God can predict the future perfectly if he wanted. God can predict the future 1,000 years in advance perfectly, right? Yes. But you're just saying it can change, right? And it's open to change. Yes, that's what I'm saying. And you're also saying that maybe it doesn't change, but it's just open to change. So it might just happen this way, but there's openness to it. Is that right? And it's like, yeah, okay. See, that's fine. That matches with the Bible and everything I read, right? And then, but closed theism was misrepresented to me because it's like, oh, well, closed theism means God can know the future. I'm like, well, then I'm definitely a closed theist. I believe in Daniel 9 and Daniel 8, and I believe those are fulfilled prophecies. Well, and then I find out, no, that's not really what closed theism is. If you think about it, you have to accept this block universe of time and everything and all this other stuff. I'm like, whoa, what? Yeah, if you're a closed theist, if you really think deeply enough about it, you have to say that God is frozen in time, like Han Solo. So, because God knows time, I'm frozen because I'm stuck because I know the future. And if I didn't know the future, um, I wouldn't be stuck if, well, it's basically knowledge of the future makes God frozen in time. Because, that, like I said, and this will be the last time I say this, but basically, closed theists will say that if God knows the future cannot change because if the future changed, God didn't know the future. So, bam, now God becomes like Han Solo. He's frozen. And this thing he's encased in is called time. Or, well, it's called knowledge of the future. Right. So, God is encased in his knowledge of the future. And he can't move. He can't change anything. He can't do anything to change it. No matter how many times you pray, nothing's going to change. It makes prayer absolutely meaningless because you ain't changing nothing. I mean, at least if you're trying to change something, nope. Just let thy will be done because it was all determined anyway. And it also makes it kind of hard to fight things like sin. Maybe you go through some tough times and you start thinking about, well, maybe if I compromise, you know? I mean, it is predetermined. I guess I was predetermined to compromise. Guess I'm still saved. Like I just feel like it kind of could lead to some stuff. That's all I'm saying. Whereas I like this view. It's nice and clean, and it doesn't make sense to me to say that you can put infinity into a box. And at some point, if you say that you believe in closed theism, you enclosed in a box, basically. It has to be enclosed. So you made the infinite. You're saying sometime life as we know it will be finite, or else you couldn't put it in a box. I don't know. So that's it. Later. I got to go to work. Didn't mean for this show to go this long. Thank you for watching.